Restaurant owner refuses black man service, then realizes he's the building's architect. The setting sun casts long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Maison Laurent, painting golden streaks across the polished marble floors. Daniel Brooks stood at the entrance, his trained eye naturally drawn to the intricate crown molding he had specified months ago. The gentle curves of the ceiling drew the gaze inward, exactly as he had intended when he spent countless hours perfecting the architectural plans. A soft smile played across his features as he observed how the ambient lighting highlighted the textured wallpaper, another of his carefully chosen details that transformed the space from merely elegant to truly extraordinary. If you love your family, subscribe now and join us for more heartwarming moments. His weathered leather messenger bag hung casually from his shoulder, containing the day's worth of architectural sketches and client meeting notes. He hadn't planned on dining here tonight, but after driving past the restaurant he had designed, something pulled him in. Perhaps it was pride, or maybe simple curiosity about how his vision had translated into reality now that the space was filled with life, conversation, and the aromatic symphony of fine cuisine. Daniel's casual attire, a well-worn navy blazer over a crisp white t-shirt, paired with designer jeans and leather sneakers, spoke of the contemporary professional he was, someone who balanced creativity with functionality. The same philosophy that guided his architectural designs guided his personal style: clean lines, quality materials, and attention to detail. His fingers absently traced the geometric patterns he had incorporated into the hostess stand, feeling the smooth transitions between surfaces that he had obsessed over during the design phase. The restaurant buzzed with the energy of a successful evening service. The soft clink of fine china and crystal mingled with the murmur of conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. The acoustic panels he had insisted on installing, despite their cost, proved their worth in the perfectly modulated ambient noise level. Several tables sat empty, their crisp white linens gleaming under the custom lighting fixtures he had sourced from an artisan in Milan. As Daniel waited patiently by the entrance, he couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in atmosphere. The hostess, who had been warmly greeting guests moments before, suddenly became intensely focused on reorganizing menus that needed no reorganizing. A server passing by with an empty tray did a double take, his welcoming smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he hurried toward the kitchen. The maitre d' held a whispered conversation with another staff member, both casting furtive glances in Daniel's direction. He had experienced this before, the quiet ripple of discomfort that sometimes spread through establishments when people saw a black man in spaces they had unconsciously reserved for others. The familiar weight of it settled on his shoulders, but he held his posture straight, maintained his dignified demeanor. After 20 years in the architecture industry, he had learned to wear his achievements like armor, though he shouldn't have had to. From across the room, Paul Chun, the restaurant's owner, emerged from his office. Daniel recognized him from the construction meetings, though they had never been formally introduced. Paul had always sent his representatives to handle the details. Paul's expensive suit and carefully styled hair spoke of someone who paid attention to appearances, who cultivated a specific image for his high-end establishment. The owner's face wore an expression that Daniel had seen too many times before, a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed displeasure. Daniel watched as Paul made his way across the restaurant, weaving between tables with practiced ease. With each step, the owner's expression hardened, his jaw setting into a firm line. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. Here he stood in a space he had created, about to be confronted by someone who couldn't see past the color of his skin to recognize the very person who had brought his vision to life. The ambient music, a playlist Daniel had suggested during the planning phases, featuring soft jazz arrangements that wouldn't overwhelm conversation, seemed to fade into the background as Paul approached. The owner's footsteps echoed slightly on the Italian marble flooring, each step deliberate and measured. Daniel noted how the overhead lighting caught the subtle patterns in the stone, another detail he had spent hours perfecting in his designs. Around them, the dinner service continued, but there was a palpable tension in the air. Regular patrons, dressed in their evening finery, barely glanced up from their meals, yet there was a subtle awareness spreading through the space. The bartender slowed his rhythmic shaking of a cocktail, his eyes darting between Paul and Daniel. A young couple being seated at a window table paused in their conversation, sensing the shifting atmosphere. Daniel's hand unconsciously moved to straighten his blazer, a habit formed over years of professional presentations and client meetings. He had designed this entrance area specifically to create a feeling of welcome and arrival, the way the ceiling height changed subtly to create a sense of transition, how the lighting warmed gradually to draw people in. Now, standing here as an unwanted guest, he felt the bitter irony of how architectural beauty could exist alongside human prejudice. The wood paneling behind the host station caught the evening light exactly as he had envisioned during the design phase. He remembered spending weeks sourcing the perfect finish that would warm the space without overwhelming it. The panels formed a subtle backdrop to the unfolding scene, their rich tones a testament to the care and consideration he had poured into every detail of this space. A server hurried past with a tray of elaborately plated dishes, the aroma of truffle and herbs wafting through the air. The kitchen door swung open briefly, offering a glimpse of the bustling workspace beyond, another area Daniel had meticulously designed for both efficiency and elegance. He could see his influence everywhere, in the graceful arch of the doorways, the thoughtful placement of service stations, the way the bar's copper accents caught and reflected the light. The sound of children's laughter drifted from a corner table where a family was celebrating what appeared to be a birthday. Daniel had insisted on including special considerations for family dining in his design, subtle divisions in the space that would allow for more animated gatherings without disturbing other diners. It was these human elements of architecture that he found most rewarding, creating spaces that could contain and enhance life's precious moments. Paul's approach seemed to take an eternity, each step measured and deliberate. The owner's face had settled into a mask of professional distance, but his eyes betrayed his discomfort. Daniel stood his ground, maintaining the quiet dignity that had become second nature in such situations. He was aware of every detail around him, the subtle texture of the wallpaper, the play of light across the custom light fixtures, the gentle curve of the bar that drew the eye through the space. Every element was a piece of himself, his vision, his expertise, now standing in silent witness to this moment. The gentle bubbling of the decorative water feature, an element Daniel had fought to include for its calming properties, provided a soundtrack to the tension. He remembered arguing for its placement, explaining how the sound would help mask conversations and create a more intimate atmosphere. Now it seemed to underscore the uncomfortable silence that preceded Paul's arrival at the host station. As Paul finally reached him, Daniel could see the owner's reflection in the antique mirror he had sourced from a small artisan workshop in Venice, another carefully chosen detail that added depth and character to the space. The mirror multiplied the scene, creating an infinite regression of this moment. The distinguished owner and the unwanted guest, standing in a space that one had commissioned and the other had created. Paul planted himself firmly behind the host station, his manicured hands gripping its edges as if to establish dominance over the territory. The polished marble surface, which Daniel had selected for its subtle veining and durability, now served as a barrier between them. The overhead lighting cast shadows across Paul's face, deepening the lines of disapproval etched around his mouth. "Do you have a reservation?" The words came out clipped and cold, each syllable sharp enough to cut through the ambient jazz playing in the background. Paul's voice carried just enough volume to draw attention from nearby tables, where conversations began to quiet, like birds falling silent before a storm. Daniel maintained his composure, years of similar encounters having taught him the delicate art of navigating such moments. His reflection in the ornate mirror behind Paul showed a man standing tall, dignified, his expression neutral, but his eyes alert and observant. "No, I don't have a reservation this evening," he replied, his voice carrying the warm, professional tone that had won over countless clients. "I was hoping to have dinner, if possible." Paul's eyes darted around the restaurant, deliberately avoiding direct eye contact with Daniel. The owner's fingers drummed against the reservation book, a needless gesture, as Daniel could clearly see the tablet discreetly positioned beside it, containing the actual evening's bookings. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Paul responded, his tone dismissive. We're fully committed this evening. We don't accept walk-ins without reservations. The lie hung in the air between them, as obvious as the several empty tables visible throughout the dining room. A couple near the window, dressed in evening wear that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could see the empty table beside them, its white tablecloth pristine and waiting, the settings gleaming under the custom lighting fixtures Daniel had designed to cast the perfect warm glow over each dining surface. "I understand," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the familiar burn of indignation rising in his chest. "I can see there are a few tables available. I'm happy to wait if that would be more convenient." He gestured subtly toward an empty foretop near the bar, where the copper accents he had specifically chosen caught the light, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere that now seemed to mock the coldness of this interaction. Paul's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his perfectly clean-shaven cheek. The owner straightened his already impeccable tie, a nervous habit that drew attention to the expensive fabric of his suit. "Those tables are reserved," he snapped, though no reserved cards grace their surfaces. "As I said, we're fully committed. Perhaps you should try somewhere more suitable." The implication in that last word hung heavy in the air, its meaning unmistakable. A server passing nearby nearly dropped her tray of water glasses, the crystal tinkling nervously as she hurried past. The sound echoed off the acoustic panels Daniel had insisted on installing in the ceiling, panels that now seemed to amplify the tension rather than soften it. Daniel let his gaze drift around the space he had created, taking in every detail he had lovingly crafted. The way the wall sconces cast their light upward to highlight the coffered ceiling, the careful placement of the bar to create a natural flow through the space, the subtle gradient of the floor tiles that guided patrons deeper into the restaurant, all elements he had designed to make people feel welcome, regardless of who they were. The irony of being turned away from a space he had poured his creativity and expertise into wasn't lost on him. He could have revealed his identity right then, could have pointed out every single design decision he'd made, from the custom wine racks to the precise angle of the banquettes. But experience had taught him that such revelations often led to awkward backpedaling rather than genuine understanding. A group of diners entered behind Daniel, their laughter cutting through the tension. Paul's demeanor shifted instantly, his face transforming into a mask of professional courtesy as he leaned to look past Daniel. The new arrivals, a party of 4 dressed in business attire, all white, were greeted with a warmth that made the previous interaction even more stark in contrast. "Ah, the Anderson party, welcome." Paul's voice had undergone a remarkable transformation, now honey-smooth and eager to please. "Your table is ready right this way." He gestured to one of the empty tables he had moments ago claimed were reserved, not even attempting to mask the contradiction. Daniel remained rooted in place, his presence a quiet challenge to the injustice unfolding before him. The Anderson party hesitated, sensing the tension they had walked into. Their eyes darted between Paul and Daniel, discomfort evident in their shifting stances and awkward glances. "I believe you should leave now," Paul said to Daniel, his voice lowered but sharp with authority. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." The words were practiced, legal, a thin veneer of legitimacy over the ugly truth beneath. The maitre d' hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling or unable to intervene. His hands fidgeted with his tablet, pretending to be absorbed in the evening's reservations while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. The man's discomfort was visible in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, in how his fingers trembled slightly as they moved across the screen. Daniel took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the smooth leather of his messenger bag strap under his fingers. Inside were the original sketches for this very space, drawings that had evolved into the reality around them. He had designed the entrance to create a sense of arrival, of welcome, the gentle curve of the ceiling drawing the eye inward, the subtle warmth of the wood paneling, the strategic placement of the host station to guide rather than barrier. Now each element seemed to stand in mute witness to this perversion of their intended purpose. "Very well," Daniel finally said, his voice carrying a quiet dignity that made several nearby diners lower their eyes to their plates. "Thank you for your time." He turned to leave, his movement deliberate and unhurried. The sound of his footsteps on the marble flooring echoed slightly, each step measuring out the distance between intention and reality, between the space he had created and the space he was denied. As he reached the door, the evening light streaming through the windows he had designed caught the subtle texture of the walls, creating the warm, welcoming glow he had spent hours perfecting. Outside, the city was coming alive with night's energy, streets filling with people seeking connection, community, and sustenance. All the things he had hoped to facilitate through his architecture. Behind him, he could hear Paul's voice resumed its artificially warm tone, guiding the Anderson party to their table. The sound of chairs being pulled out, of menus being opened, of normalcy resuming in a space that had just demonstrated its limitations. The door closed behind Daniel with a soft click, another detail he had specified. No harsh slamming, just a gentle suggestion of transition. On the sidewalk, Daniel paused for a moment, looking back at the facade he had designed. The exterior lighting was beginning to come on, highlighting the clean lines and welcoming entrance that had been his vision. Through the windows, he could see life continuing inside, could see the space working exactly as he had intended it to, creating connections and fostering gatherings, just not for him. A couple approached the entrance, their excitement for an evening out evident in their body language. They passed Daniel without a second glance, drawn in by the warmth of the lighting, the promise of the space beyond. He watched as they were greeted with smiles and led to a table, another of the supposedly reserved spots that had been unavailable moments before. The evening air carried the scent of the restaurant's cuisine, reminding Daniel of the hours he had spent designing the ventilation system to allow just enough of the kitchen's aromas to entice passers-by. Now that same attention to detail served to underscore his exclusion, a sensory reminder of the barriers that still existed despite all his professional accomplishments. As he turned to walk away, his phone buzzed in his pocket, likely an email about tomorrow's client meeting, another project, another space he would pour his expertise and vision into. The irony wasn't lost on him. Somewhere in the city, another restaurant owner might be reviewing his firm's portfolio right now, admiring photographs of this very space, unaware that its architect had been turned away at the door. The city's evening traffic created a backdrop of white noise, punctuated by distant sirens and the occasional burst of laughter from other restaurants along the street. Daniel's steps were measured and steady as he walked away from Maison Laurent, each one taking him further from the physical manifestation of his vision but closer to an understanding of how much work still remained to be done, not in architecture, but in the deeper foundations of human interaction. After Daniel's departure, Paul returned to his usual position near the bar, where the copper accents caught the evening light in ways that usually pleased him but now seemed to mock his satisfaction. He straightened his tie for the third time in as many minutes, a nervous gesture that betrayed his lingering discomfort. The Anderson party had been seated, their mild chatter joining the restaurant's ambient noise, but Paul couldn't shake the unease that clung to him like an ill-fitting suit. "We really showed him, didn't we?" Paul muttered to Marcus, one of the senior servers who had witnessed the encounter. "Can't have just anyone walking in here. We've worked too hard to build this reputation." His words carried a forced confidence that rang hollow against the meticulously designed acoustic panels overhead. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his starched collar suddenly feeling too tight. The weighted silence of the other staff members spoke volumes, their eyes carefully averted as they went about their duties with an almost excessive focus on their tasks. The bartender became intensely interested in polishing already gleaming glasses, while the hostess buried herself in reorganizing menus that had been organized just minutes before. "I mean, you saw how he was dressed," Paul continued, his voice low but carrying just far enough to reach nearby staff. "This isn't some casual dining establishment. We have standards to maintain." He gestured vaguely at the elegant surroundings, at the carefully curated atmosphere that had made Maison Laurent one of the city's most sought-after dining destinations. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and unwelcome. A junior server nearly dropped a plate of appetizers, her hands trembling slightly as she hurried past. The incident had created ripples throughout the staff, subtle but undeniable, like a stone dropped into still water. Thomas Chun, the restaurant's general manager and Paul's younger cousin, had been in the wine cellar during the confrontation, reviewing inventory among the temperature-controlled racks that held their impressive collection. He emerged now, tablet in hand, his face bright with excitement about a new allocation of rare burgundies they'd secured. "Paul, you won't believe what just came in from the distributor," Thomas began, approaching the bar. "They're finally releasing those 82 Romanicani we've been." His voice trailed off as he noticed the unusual tension in the air, the way the staff seemed to be moving with exaggerated care, as if walking on eggshells. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, his enthusiasm deflating like a punctured souffle. "Did something happen?" His eyes scanned the room, taking in the slightly strained expressions, the too careful movements of the staff. Paul waved his hand dismissively, though the gesture lacked his usual confidence. "Just had to deal with an unwanted situation. Nothing to worry about. Some guy tried to walk in without a reservation, dressed like he was going to a coffee shop. Had to maintain our standards, you know?" Thomas frowned, his tablet forgotten in his hands. "What did this person look like?" he asked, a note of concern creeping into his voice. The wine cellar's inventory could wait. Something in the atmosphere told him this was more important. "Tall, well-built, African-American," Paul replied, his voice dropping even lower. "Wearing jeans and sneakers, if you can believe it. Carrying some kind of messenger bag, like a college student. Completely inappropriate for our establishment." The color drained from Thomas's face, his grip on the tablet tightening until his knuckles showed white. "Was he wearing a navy blazer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Over a white t-shirt?" Paul's brow furrowed. "Yes, actually. How did you?" He trailed off, noting the look of horror spreading across his cousin's features. "Paul," Thomas said, his voice strained, "that was Daniel Brooks." The name hung in the air between them, heavy with significance that Paul couldn't quite grasp. "Should I know who that is?" he asked, irritation creeping into his tone. Around them, the restaurant continued its evening service, but several staff members had slowed their movements, clearly trying to overhear the conversation. Thomas set his tablet down on the bar with deliberate care, as if he needed the moment to compose himself. "Daniel Brooks," he repeated, each word carefully enunciated, "is the architect who designed this entire restaurant. Every detail you love about this place, the lighting, the acoustics, the flow of the space, it all came from him. He's one of the most respected commercial architects in the city." Paul's face went through a remarkable transformation, color draining and then flooding back in rapid succession. His hand, reaching for his tie again, froze midway. Around them, the gentle murmur of dinner service seemed to fade into the background, as if the restaurant itself was holding its breath. That's impossible," Paul stammered, but even as he spoke, memories began to surface. The construction meetings he'd skipped, sending representatives instead. The photographs he'd seen of past projects in the portfolio, never paying attention to the team behind them. The praise his friends in the industry had heaped on the design, the awards the space had won for its innovative yet practical approach. "I worked with him directly during the construction phase," Thomas continued, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "He spent countless hours here, perfecting every detail. The way the bar curves to create intimate spaces while maintaining sightlines? That was his idea. The custom lighting that makes everyone look their best? He sourced those fixtures personally from artisans in Italy." Paul's eyes darted around the restaurant, taking in each element Thomas mentioned as if seeing them for the first time. The subtle gradient in the floor tiles that guided patrons naturally through the space. The acoustic panels that kept conversation intimate without dampening the restaurant's energy. The wine cellar's precise temperature control system that had just helped them secure that rare Burgundy allocation. He insisted on that water feature by the entrance. Thomas went on, warming to his subject despite his obvious distress. Said it would create white noise to help mask private conversations. Fought for weeks to get it approved in the budget. And the ceiling height variations? They're mathematically calculated to create a sense of intimacy without claustrophobia. Each revelation landed like a physical blow. Paul gripped the edge of the bar, the same bar whose copper accents had been personally selected by the man he'd just turned away. A server passed by with a tray of entrees, the plates moving smoothly along the perfectly planned path from kitchen to dining room, another detail that hadn't happened by accident. The implications. Paul began, then stopped, his voice failing him. The implications were indeed staggering. Not just the moral weight of his actions, but the potential professional consequences. In an industry where reputation was everything, where social media could make or break a restaurant in days, this kind of incident could be devastating. He's not just any architect, Thomas added, twisting the knife without meaning to. He's won multiple awards. Half the high-end restaurants in the city want him for their renovations. His waiting list is months long. He paused, letting the information sink in. And he just tried to eat in the restaurant he designed, only to be turned away because of how he looked. The irony was brutal in its completeness. Paul's eyes were drawn to the empty table near the window, one of several he'd claimed were reserved. The evening light streaming through the carefully positioned windows cast shadows across its surface, shadows designed by the very man he'd dismissed. Around them, the restaurant continued its service, but there was a new awareness spreading through the staff. Whispers passed between servers, meaningful glances exchanged behind Paul's back. The incident would spread, first through the staff, then to their friends in other restaurants, then to the wider industry. In a city where reputation was currency, Paul had just bankrupted himself with a single interaction. The weight of his actions settled over him like a heavy blanket. Each breath felt labored, each heartbeat seemed to echo in his ears. The restaurant suddenly felt alien to him, every beautiful detail a reminder of his profound mistake. The space he had taken such pride in now stood as a monument to his prejudice, a physical manifestation of the barriers he had thoughtlessly reinforced. "What do I do?" he asked finally, his voice small against the backdrop of dinner service. But Thomas had already turned away, tablet forgotten on the bar, leaving Paul alone with the consequences of his actions and the growing realization that he had not just turned away a customer, he had rejected the very person who had helped make his success possible. Long after the last customer had left and the staff had completed their closing duties, Paul sat alone in his darkened restaurant. The only illumination came from the subtle accent lighting he'd never bothered to turn off, the same lighting Daniel Brooks had specified to showcase the restaurant's architectural features at night. The gentle glow caught the edges of empty wine glasses and created soft shadows that danced across the walls, making the space feel alive even in its emptiness. He dismissed the closing staff early, unable to bear their carefully neutral expressions and whispered conversations that died whenever he approached. Even Marcus, usually eager to share his thoughts on the evening service, had merely nodded curtly before departing. The silence that remained was deafening, filled with the echoes of his earlier words and actions. Paul's fingers traced the smooth edge of the bar where he sat, feeling the precise angle of the curve that Thomas had mentioned. How many other details had he taken for granted? How many elements of his success had he attributed to his own business acumen, never considering the brilliant mind behind the space itself? He reached for the bottle of Macallan 18 he'd poured from earlier, then stopped, remembering how he'd boasted to friends about the custom lighting that made the amber liquid glow so invitingly in its crystal decanter, another detail orchestrated by the man he'd humiliated. The water feature at the entrance continued its gentle burble, the sound carrying clearly through the empty restaurant. Paul had initially resisted its installation, arguing about the cost and maintenance. Now, sitting alone with his thoughts, he realized how it masked the street noise during business hours, creating an oasis of calm for arriving guests. Guests like Daniel Brooks, who had designed this haven only to be turned away from its shelter. His phone buzzed again, the 7th time in the past hour. He didn't need to look to know it would be Thomas, probably with more details about Daniel Brooks's achievements, or perhaps news about how quickly word of the incident was spreading through the industry. Paul had already seen the beginning of the fallout on social media. Subtle unfollows from influential food critics, a canceled reservation from a prominent food blogger, cryptic tweets from industry insiders hinting at disappointing behavior from a supposedly premium establishment. Rising from his seat, Paul began a slow walk through his restaurant, seeing it with new eyes. The path he took from the bar to the dining room felt natural, intuitive because it had been designed that way. The subtle changes in flooring texture that subconsciously guided patrons' movements, the way the ceiling height shifted to create different atmospheres in different areas, the strategic placement of mirrors that made the space feel larger while maintaining intimacy. Each element represented hours of thought, expertise, and creativity from a man Paul had judged solely on his appearance. He paused by a table near the window, the same table he'd claimed was reserved when turning Daniel away. From this vantage point, he could see how the entire restaurant spread out before him, each sight line carefully considered, each section flowing naturally into the next. The design didn't just serve its functional purpose, it created an experience, told a story, welcomed people in. Or at least it was supposed to. The irony of his actions twisted in his gut like a knife. He'd prided himself on creating an exclusive atmosphere, never realizing that true excellence had nothing to do with exclusion. The very features he'd used to justify his restaurant's premium status, the sophisticated design, the thoughtful layout, the elegant details, had all come from someone he'd deemed unworthy of experiencing them. Memories of the construction phase flooded back, taking on new meaning in light of recent events. The numerous meetings he'd skipped, sending representatives instead because he'd been too busy. Had he unconsciously avoided those meetings for other reasons? The design presentations he'd barely glanced at, focusing only on the bottom line while ignoring the artistry and expertise behind each decision. The times he'd bragged to friends about his vision for the space, taking credit for ideas that had never been his to claim. Paul found himself in the wine cellar, surrounded by bottles that rested in perfectly climate-controlled conditions, another system Daniel had insisted on, understanding that proper storage was crucial for a high-end establishment. The soft lighting here created an almost church-like atmosphere, appropriate for the confession he found himself making to the empty air. "I never even asked his name," he whispered to the rows of bottles. "Never bothered to know who created this space." His voice sounded strange in the carefully controlled acoustics of the cellar, each word coming back to him as if in accusation. The temperature control system hummed softly, maintaining the precise conditions that had helped them secure that prestigious Burgundy allocation Thomas had been so excited about earlier. Another detail he'd taken for granted, another element of his success that he'd attributed to his own business acumen rather than acknowledging the expertise behind it. Climbing back upstairs, Paul stood in the entrance where the confrontation had taken place. The host station's marble surface gleamed in the low light, its subtle veining visible even now. He remembered Daniel's hand touching it briefly as he'd stood there, perhaps recognizing the specific stone he'd selected. How must it have felt to be rejected from a space you had poured your creativity and expertise into? His reflection in the entrance mirror showed a man he barely recognized. The carefully cultivated image of a successful restaurateur seemed hollow now, stripped of its pretense by the evening's events. He'd built his reputation on providing an exclusive experience, but what did that really mean? Exclusive to whom? And at what cost? The sound of a passing car outside drew his attention to the windows. The street beyond was quiet now, but he could imagine Daniel walking away earlier, perhaps looking back at the facade he designed. The thought brought a fresh wave of shame. How many other talented, brilliant people had he dismissed over the years based on nothing more than their appearance? His phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from a local food blog. The headline made his heart sink. Award-winning restaurant faces accusations of discrimination. The article hadn't named names yet, but it was only a matter of time. In the cutthroat world of high-end dining, reputations built over years could crumble in days. But as he stared at the screen, Paul realized his fear of professional consequences paled in comparison to the deeper revelation taking shape in his mind. This wasn't just about saving his restaurant's reputation or avoiding bad press. It was about confronting the prejudices he'd carried so casually, the assumptions he'd made so thoughtlessly, the barriers he'd reinforced so automatically. The restaurant stood silent around him, every beautiful detail now a reminder of the talent he'd dismissed, the brilliance he'd failed to recognize. The space that had been his pride and joy now felt like a mirror reflecting back his own biases and blind spots. Each carefully considered element, from the custom light fixtures to the acoustic panels, from the wine cellar cooling system to the water feature's gentle burble, spoke of a level of expertise and dedication he'd completely failed to honor. Dawn was approaching, the first hints of light beginning to filter through the windows Daniel had positioned so carefully to capture both morning and evening light. Paul remained standing in his empty restaurant, understanding finally dawning that his journey of reflection couldn't end with this night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, damage control, public relations, industry fallout, but the real work would be internal. He needed to do more than just apologize. He needed to change. Looking around at the space one last time before heading to his office to begin drafting a response to the growing crisis, Paul made a silent promise to the empty restaurant. This place, designed to bring people together, to create moments of joy and connection, would eventually live up to its potential. But first, he had to face his own failings and begin the harder work of genuine transformation. The morning light streamed through the windows of Paul's office, casting long shadows across the pile of business cards and contacts he'd been sorting through for hours. His usual crisp appearance had given way to something more disheveled, his tie loosened, shirt sleeves rolled up, hair slightly mussed from running his fingers through it repeatedly. Coffee cups in various stages of emptiness littered his desk, testament to the sleepless night he'd spent planning this moment. Thomas had refused to simply give him Daniel's contact information, insisting that if Paul wanted to make amends, he needed to put in the work himself. "You didn't take the time to know him before," Thomas had said, his voice tight with disappointment over the phone. "Maybe that's where you should start." So Paul had begun his search through years of construction documents, contracts, and correspondence. Each paper trail revealed more about the man he dismissed, making his shame grow deeper. Awards for innovative urban design, features in architectural magazines, glowing testimonials from other restaurant owners who spoke of Daniel's ability to transform spaces into experiences. A call to the construction company had yielded Daniel's firm's name, Brooks and Associates Architectural Design. Their website showcased a portfolio that made Paul's breath catch in his throat. There was his restaurant, featured prominently among other stunning projects, each one a testament to the vision and skill he'd so casually rejected. The photos of Maison Laurent captured angles and details he'd never fully appreciated before, accompanied by thoughtful explanations of the design choices that had made the space so successful. The business district was already humming with activity when Paul's car pulled up outside the gleaming office building that housed Brooks and Associates. He sat in his parked car for several long moments, adjusting and readjusting his tie in the rearview mirror. The selection of his outfit had been a careful consideration. His finest suit felt simultaneously like too much and not enough for this moment. In his hands, he clutched a leather portfolio containing notes he'd spent hours preparing. Different versions of apologies, each one feeling inadequate as soon as he'd written it down. How did one apologize for something so fundamental? For failing to see someone's humanity? For dismissing their worth based on nothing but prejudice? The security guard in the lobby eyed him with professional detachment as Paul signed in, his hand slightly unsteady as he wrote his name in the visitor's log. "I'm here to see Daniel Brooks," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth, a name he should have known, should have respected, long before this moment. "Do you have an appointment?" the guard asked, and Paul felt the bitter irony of the question. No, he didn't have an appointment, just as Daniel hadn't had a reservation. But unlike his own response last night, the guard simply picked up the phone when Paul admitted he didn't have one. The elevator ride to the 14th floor gave Paul too much time to think. His reflection in the polished doors showed a man he barely recognized, someone smaller somehow, stripped of the artificial importance he'd wrapped himself in. The soft ping of each passing floor marked the countdown to a conversation he both dreaded and knew was absolutely necessary. Brooks and Associates occupied the entire floor, its reception area a study in the same thoughtful design Paul had benefited from but failed to appreciate. Natural light flooded the space through floor-to-ceiling windows, while subtle architectural details drew the eye through the room in a way that felt both welcoming and professional. Even here, in his own office, Daniel's talent for creating inclusive spaces was evident. The receptionist's polite smile didn't waver as Paul stated his name and purpose, though something flickered in her eyes. News traveled fast in professional circles, and Paul suspected his actions from the previous night were already common knowledge. "Mr. Brooks is in a meeting," she informed him, her tone professional but cool. "I can let him know you're here, B. I can't guarantee he'll be available to see you." Paul nodded, accepting this uncertainty as part of his penance. He took a seat in the waiting area, noting how the chairs were positioned to create both privacy and community, another thoughtful design element he might have overlooked just 24 hours ago. From his vantage point, he could see staff members moving through the office beyond, their conversations muted by the same acoustic engineering that made his own restaurant such a pleasant space for dining. Time stretched like taffy as he waited. Each passing minute brought new insights as he observed the space around him. The way the lighting changed subtly throughout the room, accommodating different tasks and moods. The flow of movement through the office, how even the placement of plants and artwork served both aesthetic and functional purposes. He was sitting in a living testament to everything he'd failed to appreciate about Daniel's work. His phone buzzed periodically with notifications he couldn't bring himself to check. The incident was gaining traction on social media, with food critics and industry insiders beginning to ask pointed questions. His PR team had been sending increasingly urgent messages about the need for a public response. But Paul knew that before he could address the public, he needed to face the man he'd wronged. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, the receptionist's phone buzzed. She listened for a moment, then looked up at Paul. "Mr. Brooks will see you now," she said, standing to guide him through the office. The walk to Daniel's office felt like a procession, each step weighted with significance. Staff members glanced up as he passed, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes following his progress. Paul wondered how many of them knew who he was, how many had already heard about last night's events. Daniel's office was a corner space, but it wasn't the typical executive showroom Paul had expected. Instead, it was clearly a working architect's domain, drawings spread across surfaces, material samples organized on shelves, a large drafting table positioned to take advantage of the natural light. And there, standing near a wall of windows that offered a spectacular view of the city, was Daniel Brooks. He looked exactly as he had the night before, except now he wore a well-tailored suit that probably cost more than Paul's. The casual outfit from the restaurant sat draped over a chair in the corner, a silent reminder that a person's worth couldn't be measured by their clothing choices. "Mr. Chin," Daniel said, his voice level and professional. "Please have a seat." He gestured to a chair positioned near his desk, the same quiet dignity from the previous night evident in every movement. Paul sank into the offered chair, his carefully prepared notes suddenly feeling worthless. What could he possibly say to make this right? How could he explain that in the hours since their encounter, his entire worldview had been shaken to its core? The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of office activity and the subtle hum of the building's systems. Paul's hand moved automatically to straighten his tie, but he forced it back down. No more hiding behind gestures of false confidence. "Mr. Brooks," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. The words he'd rehearsed felt hollow in the face of reality. In this office, surrounded by evidence of Daniel's success and talent, Paul finally understood the true magnitude of his failure, not just as a businessman, but as a human being. In Daniel's office, the morning light cast long shadows across the floor, creating patterns that seemed to mirror the complexity of the moment. Paul's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white with tension. The leather portfolio containing his prepared apologies lay forgotten at his feet, its contents suddenly seeming inadequate in the face of reality. "Before you begin," Daniel said, his voice carrying the same measured tone he'd used the night before, "I want you to look around this office." He gestured to the walls, where framed designs and awards hung alongside in-progress sketches. "What do you see?" Paul's eyes moved across the space, taking in the evidence of a career built on talent, dedication, and perseverance. Architectural drawings showed spaces he recognized: high-end restaurants, boutique hotels, cultural centers. Each one represented not just a project, but a vision brought to life through expertise and understanding. "I see success," Paul managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see achievement. I see." He trailed off, the weight of his next words heavy on his tongue. "I see everything I failed to see last night." Daniel nodded slowly, moving to stand near the large drafting table that dominated one corner of the office. His fingers traced the edge of a blueprint. Paul recognized it as an early design for Maison Laurent. "Success," Daniel repeated thoughtfully. "But what you're looking at is just the end result. What you don't see are the countless times I've been turned away from the very spaces I designed. The assumptions people make when they see me. The extra credentials I need to carry, just in case someone questions my right to be somewhere." He pulled out the blueprint, spreading it across the table. Paul could see the familiar lines of his restaurant taking shape on the paper, each detail meticulously planned. "When I designed your restaurant," Daniel continued, "I thought about every person who might walk through those doors. I considered how the space would welcome them, make them feel valued, create an experience that transcended mere dining. That's what architecture should do: break down barriers, not build them up." Paul felt each word like a physical blow. The careful planning, the thoughtful details, the inclusive vision, all of it had been corrupted by his own prejudices. "I came to apologize," he said, the words feeling small in the space between them. "But sitting here, seeing all of this, I realize an apology isn't enough." "No," Daniel agreed, turning to face him fully. "It isn't. But recognition of that fact is a starting point." He moved to his desk, pulling out a folder that Paul recognized as the original proposal for Maison Laurent. "Tell me, Mr. Chin, what did you think when you first received these designs?" The question caught Paul off guard. He struggled to remember his initial reactions, now seeing them through the lens of his recent awakening. "I thought they were brilliant," he admitted. "The way the space flowed, how every element served both form and function. I told everyone who would listen that I had secured the best designer in the city." "And yet," Daniel said quietly, "when that same designer walked into your restaurant, dressed casually after a long day of creating spaces like yours, you saw only what you expected to see. What does that tell you about the barriers that exist in your mind?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Paul felt the familiar urge to defend himself, to make excuses, but he forced it down. "It tells me that I've been part of the problem," he said finally. "That I've perpetuated the very barriers you work to break down through your designs." Daniel's expression softened slightly, though his posture remained professional. "Do you know what I thought about most when designing Maison Laurent?" he asked, turning to look out the window at the city sprawling below. "I thought about moments. The first date that might bloom into love. The business deal that could change lives. The family celebration that would become a cherished memory. I designed every corner of that space to facilitate those moments for everyone." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of office activity beyond the door. Paul found himself looking at the blueprint again, seeing it now as more than just a design. It was a vision of inclusivity that he had failed to honor. "Last night," Daniel continued, his voice taking on a teaching tone rather than an accusatory one, "I watched you turn away not just me, but everything that space was meant to represent. Every careful decision, every thoughtful detail, every consideration for human dignity, you negated it all with a single action." Paul felt the truth of those words in his chest. "I've spent the night thinking about that moment," he confessed. "About how many other times I might have done the same thing without even realizing it. About how many moments, as you call them, I might have prevented from happening." Daniel moved back to his desk, picking up a small-scale model of what appeared to be a community center. "In architecture," he said, studying the model, "we learned that every decision has consequences. A wall placed here affects the light there. A door positioned this way influences how people move through space. But the same is true of our actions, Mr. Chin. Every time we exclude someone, we create ripples we might never see." "I want to make it right," Paul said, leaning forward in his chair. Not just with you, but with everyone who might have felt unwelcome in a space that was designed to welcome them. That's a start, Daniel acknowledged. But real change isn't about a single moment of revelation. It's about the continuous work of examining our assumptions, challenging our biases, and actively working to create the inclusive spaces we claim to want. He set the model down and turned to face Paul directly. I've had this conversation before, in various forms. Sometimes it's with clients who are surprised to discover I'm the architect. Sometimes it's with contractors who question my decisions until they see my credentials. Each time, I have to decide how much of myself to invest in educating others about their biases. Paul absorbed this, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. I understand if you don't want to invest that energy with me, he said quietly. I wouldn't blame you for simply accepting my apology, or not, and showing me the door. A slight smile touched Daniel's lips, the first Paul had seen. If I believed in closing doors, Mr. Chen, I wouldn't be very good at my job, would I? He moved to retrieve something from his desk drawer. I've been working on preliminary designs for an expansion of your wine cellar. Thomas mentioned you were running out of space for your collection. The gesture, continuing to think about improving the restaurant even after last night's incident, struck Paul deeply. I don't deserve your consideration, he said honestly. This isn't about what you deserve, Daniel replied, spreading the new designs on his desk. It's about what the space deserves, what your patrons deserve, what the community deserves. The question is, are you ready to be part of creating something better than what existed before? The question encompassed far more than just the wine cellar expansion, and they both knew it. It was about transformation, not just of physical space, but of mindset, of culture, of possibility. Yes, Paul said simply, understanding that this was not an endpoint, but a beginning. Yes, I am. Daniel nodded, his expression serious, but no longer distant. Then let's talk about building something new. 3 months after the incident, Maison Laurent hummed with a different kind of energy. The physical space remained as beautiful as ever, but subtle changes permeated the atmosphere. The staff moved with a new awareness, their interactions with guests marked by genuine warmth rather than calculated exclusivity. The host station, once wielded as a barrier, had been transformed into a genuine welcome point, with the water feature Daniel had designed providing its intended soothing backdrop. Paul stood in the center of his restaurant, watching the dinner service unfold. The morning staff meeting had focused on their latest initiative, a mentorship program partnering with local culinary schools to provide opportunities for aspiring chefs and restaurateurs from underrepresented communities. The idea had emerged from one of many conversations with Daniel, who had gradually shifted from architect to advisor, helping Paul understand how physical spaces and social structures could work together to create true inclusion. The changes hadn't come easily. The first weeks after the incident had been challenging, with social media criticism and cancel reservations threatening the restaurant's stability. But Paul had refused to take the easy route of a quick public apology and token gestures. Instead, guided by Daniel's insights, he had embarked on a comprehensive transformation of his restaurant's culture. The new training program for staff had been the first step. Led by diversity consultants recommended by Daniel, the sessions went beyond superficial sensitivity training to explore how unconscious bias manifested in hospitality settings. The discussions had been uncomfortable at times, revealing ingrained attitudes that many, including Paul himself, hadn't realized they carried. Tonight's service showcased the results of these efforts. At a corner table, a young couple celebrating their engagement were being served with the same attention and respect as the CEO dining near the window. The bar area, once an unofficial fortress of exclusivity, now welcomed a diverse mix of patrons, its carefully designed acoustics ensuring everyone could enjoy comfortable conversation. Thomas, who had initially been skeptical of his cousin's promises to change, now moved through the restaurant with renewed pride. He had become an essential part of the transformation, his previous experience working with Daniel helping bridge the gap between the restaurant's past and its evolving future. The wine cellar expansion project had become a symbol of this evolution, not just a physical renovation, but a reimagining of what the space could mean for the community. The new weekly industry nights had become particularly successful, transforming traditionally quiet Mondays into vibrant gatherings where local hospitality workers, regardless of their position or background, could experience fine dining at accessible prices. The initiative had helped rebuild bridges with the restaurant community while creating opportunities for networking and mentorship that transcended traditional barriers. Paul paused by the bar, where the copper accents still caught the light exactly as Daniel had intended. The architectural beauty of the space remained unchanged, but his appreciation for it had deepened. Every detail now told a story not just of design excellence, but of the importance of seeing and valuing the people behind the creation. The evening's special event had required weeks of planning and no small amount of courage. Paul adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he still hadn't shed, as he watched the private dining room fill with guests. Daniel had agreed to host a discussion series about inclusive design in hospitality spaces, using Maison Laurent's journey as a case study in how physical environments could either reinforce or break down social barriers. The room represented a cross-section of the industry: restaurant owners, architects, designers, chefs, and service staff. Paul noticed how the space naturally encouraged interaction, with Daniel's careful design choices facilitating comfortable conversation between people who might not typically cross paths in the hierarchical world of fine dining. As Daniel began his presentation, Paul found himself studying the faces in the audience. There was genuine engagement as the architect explained how thoughtful design could create environments that welcomed rather than excluded. The discussion that followed was honest and sometimes challenging, with participants sharing their own experiences of exclusion and bias in the industry. The transformation of Maison Laurent had not gone unnoticed in the broader community. Other restaurant owners had begun reaching out, seeking advice on how to examine and change their own practices. The incident that Paul had once feared would destroy his business had instead sparked a wider conversation about inclusion in fine dining. Near the end of the evening, Paul watched as Daniel chatted with a group of young architects, sharing insights about how design choices could influence social dynamics. The scene stood in sharp contrast to that night 3 months ago. The same man who had been turned away was now helping shape the future of hospitality spaces, his expertise finally receiving the recognition it deserved in this venue. The wine cellar expansion was nearing completion, its design incorporating suggestions from staff at all levels. The space would include a teaching area for wine education programs, making expertise more accessible to those traditionally excluded from such knowledge. The project had become a collaboration between Paul and Daniel that went beyond architecture, embodying their shared vision for a more inclusive industry. As the last guest departed, Paul found himself standing with Daniel in the now quiet restaurant. The evening light filtered through the windows, creating the warm, welcoming atmosphere that had been intended all along. "We've made progress," Paul said quietly, "but there's still so much work to do." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed the space. "Change is never finished," he replied. "It's a continuous process of learning, adapting, and growing. But the first step is creating spaces, both physical and social, where that change can happen." The restaurant stood as testament to this philosophy. While its physical beauty remained unchanged, its spirit had been transformed. Each detail that Daniel had originally designed to welcome and embrace now fulfilled its true purpose, creating a space where barriers fell away and connections flourished. As they walked toward the entrance, Paul reflected on how far they had come and how far they had yet to go. The water feature burbled softly, its sound a reminder of the constant flow of change. Maison Laurent was no longer just a fine dining establishment. It had become a model for how spaces could transform when design and social consciousness worked in harmony. The night air carried the promise of autumn as they stepped outside. The restaurant's lights illuminated the sidewalk, welcoming rather than excluding, just as Daniel had always intended. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new chances to prove that their commitment to change was more than just words. But for now, they stood in comfortable silence, two men who had moved from confrontation to collaboration, their shared vision for a more inclusive future taking shape in both concrete and abstract ways.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.